Jake never imagined that the biggest sacrifice he'd ever made for love would be rewarded with the deepest betrayal he'd ever experienced. At 32, this commercial airline pilot had given up everything familiar, his hometown, his family, his entire support system, to help his 28-year-old physician wife pursue her dream job on the West Coast. What should have been the beginning of an exciting new chapter in their lives instead became the most painful period of their 7-year relationship. The story began over a year ago when Jake's wife, Dr. Sarah, received what seemed like the opportunity of a lifetime. A prestigious medical position on the West Coast had opened up, offering her significantly better compensation, more advanced facilities, and the kind of career advancements that physicians dream about throughout their training years. Jake and Sarah had built their entire adult lives in the Southeast United States, where they'd both grown up and where all their family connections remained. For Jake especially, leaving the Southeast meant abandoning the only home he'd ever known. His parents, siblings, extended family, and closest friends all lived within a few hours' drive of their current location. Jake's initial reaction to Sarah's job opportunity was resistance, which was completely understandable given what the move would cost him personally. He had deep roots in the Southeast, with family traditions, familiar places, and a sense of belonging that had been cultivated over 3 decades of life in the same region. However, Jake's love for Sarah ultimately overrode his personal preferences and comfort zone. When he saw how excited and energized she became talking about this new position, he began to reconsider his opposition to the move. Sarah's enthusiasm was contagious, and Jake found himself wondering if perhaps a major life change might benefit both of them. As a commercial airline pilot, Jake had more geographic flexibility than many professionals. Airlines operate hub systems, and pilots can often transfer between different hub cities based on company needs and seniority. While changing hubs would require adjustments and potentially affect his route preferences and schedule, it was logistically feasible for his career. The decision to support Sarah's career move demonstrated Jake's commitment to their marriage and his willingness to prioritize their relationship over his own comfort and preferences. This kind of sacrifice, leaving family, familiar surroundings, and established social networks, represents one of the most significant gestures of love and partnership that someone can make. Have you ever made a major life sacrifice for your partner's career or dreams? How did that decision affect your relationship and your own sense of identity? The practical aspects of their cross-country relocation were handled through Sarah's employer's relocation program, which provided assistance with selling their existing home and purchasing a new one on the West Coast. This corporate support made the logistics smoother, but couldn't address the emotional and social challenges of starting over in a new city. Initially, the move seemed to be working out exactly as they'd hoped. Sarah was thriving in her new position, and Jake was adjusting to his new hub assignment. They had successfully navigated the stressful process of selling and buying homes, moving their belongings across the country, and establishing themselves in a new city. For the first several months, Jake felt good about the decision they'd made together. The financial benefits were real, Sarah was clearly happier and more fulfilled professionally, and Jake was proud of the supportive role he'd played in making her dream opportunity possible. But then Jake began noticing changes in Sarah's behavior that didn't align with the woman he'd known for 7 years. Sarah had always been a homebody who preferred quiet evenings at home to social activities. Throughout their relationship, she'd consistently chosen staying in over going out, and Jake had grown accustomed to her preference for domestic tranquility. Suddenly, Sarah was going out multiple nights per week, which was completely out of character for her established patterns and preferences. At first, Jake interpreted this change positively, assuming that Sarah was finally making friends in their new city and developing a social network that would help her feel more settled and connected. Jake was actually happy about Sarah's apparent social expansion because he understood how important it was for both of them to build new relationships and community connections in their new home. He encouraged her newfound social activity because he thought it meant she was successfully adapting to their new environment. However, other changes began accumulating that created a pattern of suspicious behavior. The most significant red flag was Sarah's decision to change the passcode on her phone, a passcode that had remained the same throughout their entire relationship, including their 7 years together. The phone passcode change wasn't discovered through snooping or suspicious investigation. Jake simply needed to make a call when his own phone was dead, which was a normal occurrence in their relationship where they freely used each other's devices. When he couldn't access her phone with the familiar code, he asked Sarah about the change. What seemingly small changes in your partner's behavior have turned out to be signs of bigger problems? How do you distinguish between normal life changes and red flags? Sarah's response to Jake's question about the passcode change was dismissive and unhelpful. She simply said, "just because," without providing any reasonable explanation for suddenly securing her phone against access that had been freely given throughout their relationship. More concerning, she refused to share the new passcode with Jake. This phone security change represented a fundamental shift in their relationship dynamic. Couples who have been together for years typically develop patterns of openness and transparency, including shared access to devices and accounts. Sarah's sudden need for privacy suggested she had something to hide. Another seemingly minor but significant change was Sarah's decision to get red nail polish. This might seem trivial to outsiders, but Jake knew Sarah well enough to recognize how out of character this choice was. Sarah had always hated the color red and had never worn red nail polish during their entire relationship. While individual behavior changes might be explained by personal growth, new environment influences, or simple preference evolution, the combination of going out frequently, securing her phone, and adopting a color she'd always disliked created a pattern that suggested something more significant was happening. Jake's detective work began when he decided to take a day off work to investigate his growing suspicions. As an airline pilot, Jake had flexibility in his schedule that allowed him to plan surveillance without Sarah knowing about his availability. Jake told Sarah that he had a flight to Atlanta, which would mean he'd be away during the day but home that night. This lie was necessary to create the opportunity to observe Sarah's behavior when she believed she had privacy and freedom from his presence. Jake left their house at 4:30 a.m., as he would for an actual early flight. But instead of going to the airport, he positioned himself at a nearby intersection where he could observe their home without being detected. This kind of surveillance represents the painful lengths that betrayed spouses sometimes go to in order to confirm their worst fears. Sure enough, about 30 minutes after Jake's departure, a car pulled into their driveway. Jake had the presence of mind to record video evidence of this visitor, documentation that would later prove crucial in confronting the situation and potentially in legal proceedings. How do you handle the moment when your worst suspicions are confirmed? What goes through your mind when you realize that your partner has been lying to you for months? When Jake confronted Sarah and her affair partner with the evidence, the other man immediately fled the scene, leaving Sarah to face the consequences of her betrayal alone. This behavior from the affair partner demonstrated the cowardly nature of his participation in the relationship, willing to pursue a married woman but unwilling to face the consequences when discovered. Sarah's immediate response was begging and pleading, asking Jake not to leave her. This reaction suggested that despite her months of deceptive behavior, she still wanted to preserve their marriage, perhaps indicating that the affair was more about escape or validation than about finding a replacement for Jake. The aftermath of the discovery left Jake in an impossible situation. He was now living in a city where he didn't want to be, thousands of miles from his family and support system, with a woman who had betrayed his trust and sacrifice. The home they'd purchased together, which should have represented their fresh start and shared future, had become a prison of painful memories and awkward cohabitation. Jake described his current living situation as treating Sarah like a roommate rather than a wife. This emotional distance was a natural protective mechanism, but it also highlighted how fundamentally their relationship had been damaged by Sarah's betrayal. The practical complications of their situation were significant. Jake owned half of their house and had moved all his belongings across the country. Untangling their shared life would require major logistical effort and financial decisions, especially given that they were in a location where Jake had no other connections or alternative living arrangements. Sarah's family had inserted themselves into the situation, pressuring Jake to attempt reconciliation and marriage counseling. This external pressure added another layer of stress to Jake's decision-making process, as he was being asked to consider not just his own feelings and Sarah's desires, but also the preferences of her extended family. Sarah's claim that Jake was the only person she knows in this city and that he can't leave her alone was particularly manipulative. This argument essentially asked Jake to take responsibility for Sarah's social isolation, which was partially the result of her own choices to pursue an affair rather than building legitimate friendships and community connections. The manipulation was compounded by the fact that Sarah's isolation was largely self-created. Instead of using her first months in the new city to build healthy relationships with colleagues, neighbors, and community members, she had invested her time and emotional energy in a deceptive affair relationship. Sarah's post-discovery behavior included sending Jake photos every 10 minutes when he was away and giving him all her passwords. While these actions might seem like attempts at transparency and rebuilding trust, they also represented a level of monitoring and control that was unhealthy for both partners. Is constant monitoring and surveillance a healthy way to rebuild trust after infidelity, or does it create a different kind of toxic relationship dynamic? Jake's ambivalence about the situation was understandable given the complexity of his circumstances. He still loved Sarah after 7 years together, and part of him was willing to work on rebuilding their relationship. However, he also recognized that successful reconciliation would require years of effort with no guarantee of success. The sleep deprivation that Jake was experiencing reflected the psychological toll of living with unresolved betrayal and relationship uncertainty. When Sarah begged him to sleep in their bedroom, the attempt at physical closeness only highlighted how much emotional distance had developed between them. Jake's questions about whether others had successfully recovered from similar situations reflected his desperate need for hope and guidance. He wanted to know if the pain and effort of reconciliation could actually lead to a restored marriage, or if they were just delaying an inevitable divorce. The timeline question was particularly important because Jake needed to understand the scope of commitment required for genuine recovery. Affair recovery experts typically estimate that rebuilding trust and emotional intimacy after infidelity takes 2 to 5 years of consistent effort from both partners. Jake's question about whether things could return to normal revealed a common misunderstanding about affair recovery. The goal isn't to return to the previous relationship dynamic, which had vulnerabilities that allowed the affair to occur. Instead, successful recovery involves creating a new, stronger relationship with better communication, boundaries, and mutual understanding. The geographic isolation that Jake faced made his situation particularly challenging. Most betrayed spouses have access to family support, familiar surroundings, and established social networks during the crisis. Jake had given up all of these support systems to facilitate Sarah's career move, leaving him particularly vulnerable during the aftermath of discovering her betrayal. Professional counselors who work with couples affected by infidelity emphasize that successful recovery requires the cheating partner to demonstrate genuine remorse, complete transparency, and sustained effort to rebuild trust. Sarah's begging and pleading were encouraging signs, but real change would require consistent actions over months and years. The decision Jake faced wasn't just about forgiveness and relationship repair. It was also about whether he wanted to build a life in a location he'd never chosen for himself, with someone who had demonstrated that his sacrifices and trust could be casually discarded when she found something more appealing. Should geographic sacrifices made for a partner's career create additional obligations to work through relationship problems, or do they make betrayal even more unforgivable? The house ownership issue represented one of the practical complications that make affair recovery more complex when couples have significant shared assets. Jake couldn't simply walk away without dealing with property division, financial consequences, and the logistics of either selling or buying out his share of their home. The cultural pressure from Sarah's family reflected a common dynamic in affair situations, where extended family members encourage reconciliation without fully understanding the depth of damage that betrayal creates. Their perspective focused on preserving the marriage rather than supporting Jake's emotional needs and recovery process. Jake's career as a commercial airline pilot offered him unique advantages and disadvantages in this situation. While he could potentially transfer back to a Southeast hub and rebuild his life near family, the process would involve professional complications and potential impacts on his seniority and route preferences. The red nail polish detail, while seemingly minor, represented the kind of small but significant changes that affairs often bring to relationships. Sarah had adopted preferences and behaviors that aligned with her affair partner's tastes rather than her own established identity, showing how deeply the affair had affected her sense of self. Sarah's transformation from a homebody who hated going out to someone who was socializing multiple nights per week demonstrated how affairs can temporarily change people's entire personality and lifestyle. This change wasn't genuine personal growth, but rather an adaptation to maintain a deceptive double life. The timing of Sarah's affair, immediately after Jake had made enormous personal sacrifices to support her career, made the betrayal particularly cruel. She had violated their relationship during the very period when Jake's commitment and love had been most clearly demonstrated through his willingness to leave everything familiar. Jake's struggle with whether to stay and work on the marriage reflected the classic dilemma faced by betrayed spouses: whether to invest in repairing a damaged relationship or cut losses and start over. There were no guaranteed right answers, only difficult choices with significant consequences either way. The sleep deprivation and emotional exhaustion that Jake described were typical responses to discovering infidelity. The trauma of betrayal creates ongoing stress that affects physical health, mental clarity, and decision-making capacity, making it even more difficult to navigate the complex choices that affair discovery demands. Ultimately, Jake's decision would need to be based on his assessment of several factors: Sarah's capacity for genuine change and sustained effort, his own ability to rebuild trust and emotional intimacy, the practical realities of their shared life and assets, and his long-term vision for his own happiness and fulfillment. The question of whether their marriage could survive would depend not just on their willingness to work on recovery, but on their ability to address the underlying issues that had made Sarah vulnerable to an affair in the first place. Without understanding and changing those foundational problems, they would remain at risk for future betrayals regardless of their immediate reconciliation efforts. Jake's story illustrated the complex intersection of love, sacrifice, betrayal, and practical reality that makes affair recovery one of the most challenging experiences a couple can face. His ultimate choice would determine not just the fate of their marriage, but the entire trajectory of his life, career, and personal happiness in ways that would echo for years to come.